Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with James Carroll discussing his latest book, The Truth at the Heart of the Lie: How the Catholic Church Lost Its Soul. He is joined tonight in conversation by Mike Rezendes. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our new digital community during these challenging times. Our spring season is in full swing, so make sure to check out our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to purchase a copy of The Truth at the Heart of the Lie, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you, especially during this difficult time for community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your purchases and financial contributions, this virtual author series wouldn't be possible. So thank you more than ever for supporting a landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year and change, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. So thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now, I am so pleased to introduce today's speakers. James Carroll is a busy man. He's been a priest, playwright, professor with honorary degrees from several universities. And sometime between all of that, he's had time to write 12 novels and 8 works of nonfiction, including The Cloister and Constantine's Sword. His op-ed ran from 1992 to 2015 in the Boston Globe, and his other writings have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and among others. He is the recipient of the National Book Award, the PEN Award, and the Scripps Howard Award. He is joined tonight in conversation by Mike Rezendes. Mike is a senior investigative reporter with the Global Investigations team at the Associated Press. Previously, he worked for the Boston Globe Spotlight team, where he shared a Pulitzer Prize for revealing the cover-up of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. You might have seen him played on the silver screen by Mark Ruffalo in the film Spotlight. Mike has been a Pulitzer Prize finalist twice. Recently, he published an article exposing the church for taking PPP aid during COVID while they were sitting on billions. Tonight, they're discussing the truth at the heart of the lie. In this striking book, James takes a thorough look at himself, his faith, and the Catholic Church itself. He argues that a male supremacist clericalism is both the root cause and the ongoing enabler of the sexual abuse crisis. This book is both an exposure of the problems and a call for the much needed reform. I'll leave you with this quote from Stephen Greenblatt, who's one of my favorite writers. This moving and revelatory book, written from a deep personal experience, takes us to the heart of one of the great institutional and existential crises of our time. And on that note of praise, I'll turn things over to our speakers. Jim, Mike, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Hey, thanks very much. Really such a pleasure to be here.
And me too. I have to jump at the chance to thank you, Audrey, and thank the Harvard Bookstore folks. Jeff Meyerson, before Jeff, Frank Kramer. I go way back with Harvard Bookstore. I just told Mike I think I've introduced almost every one of my books at the Harvard Bookstore. My book isn't published until I'm at the Harvard Bookstore. But tonight, Mike, I have to say, it's more than a normal pleasure and honor to be with you. The work I recount in this book, it took its most important impetus really from the work you did and do. And I'm so grateful for the chance to salute you personally and to thank you personally for the brave and thoughtful work you've done all these years. Without you and your colleagues, but in a very particular way you, this deeply troubling scandal that's at the heart of the Catholic problem today, and therefore my own personal problem, without you, it would still be mostly hidden. So I'm thrilled to have this chance to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Well, so very nice of you to say. And I think I have to follow that up by saying that through all my years of questioning and doubting my own Catholicism, I did grow up a practicing Catholic, and much of my family are still devout Catholics. You were writing your column in the Boston Globe, and when I tried to explain how I felt about the Catholic Church, I would often use shorthand and say, well, I'm a James Carroll Catholic, meaning, meaning I try hard to believe and sometimes fail. So, but I appreciate your remarks very much. And as someone who has spent much of the last 20 years investigating the Catholic Church and covering the clergy sex abuse crisis, I was so impressed with your book overall, moved by your book, and impressed that it really was motivated by the clergy sex abuse crisis in the church. There's a point where you say that, well, you describe your book as a memoir of faith, and it is that. But also it strikes me as a chronicle of a crisis of faith. And at one point you describe yourself as a shattered believer forced to confront the corruption at the heart of my faith. That's really incredibly strong language. And I'd just be interested in whether you could talk to us about how you came to feel so so impassioned and so angry about this issue.
Well, you won't be surprised, Mike, when I say that I've been living with this particular problem as a Catholic for many, many years, going back even before the great work of the Spotlight team. I began as a columnist in the early 1990s with the Boston Globe, and one of my first columns was about the James Porter case. Father James Porter, a priest, I believe, of Fall River.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Who was a predator. And the Boston Globe's reporting on the Porter case was the beginning of the Globe's challenge to the church, although it didn't come to its climax until the work of the Spotlight team. But I've been aware of this perversion in the priesthood for decades now. I was a Catholic priest myself, as you know, from 1969 to 1974. And as I recount in this book, I wasn't aware of it then. I was in what I would call complicit denial of this problem. One of my colleagues, someone you got to know very well, or you got to know about him very well, was Paul Shanley.
Oh, sure.
Who was a Catholic chaplain at Boston State College, as UMass Boston was called in those days.
Right.
And I was the Catholic chaplain at Boston University. And even though I had certain issues with Paul Shanley, I was one of many people who thought of him as an upstanding priest doing really good work. I was blind to the blatant predator behavior that he was guilty of, and for which he spent a good number of years in prison as a result of the work that Boston Globe did.
Right.
And you. So I've been aware of this problem, but it didn't take me back from my place at the altar, going to communion, going to mass every week, practicing my faith, finding a way to live with what I knew about the corruptions of some priests and almost all bishops. The story for me always has been a minority of priests abused children. Almost all of the bishops protected the predators instead of the victims. And to me, that's always been the main revelation of the deep dysfunction here. But what I'm really trying to say is that business as usual became impossible for me in these years of Pope Francis's pontificate. And that seems an odd thing to say. Pope Francis arrived as a breath of fresh air for Catholics like me. I thought of him and think of him as someone in the John the 23rd mold, the Pope of the Second Vatican Council, the reforming Pope who tried to help the Catholic Church finally reckon with what had been laid bare during the Holocaust.
Right.
Well, I thought Francis's role was to help the church reckon finally with what was laid bare in the priestly sex abuse crisis. And for all of the great work Francis has done and all that he represents, concern for migrants, defense of democracy against populism, concern for the climate, a savage critic of inequality and runaway capitalism, all of that precious, precious work that he's done. The most important single thing he had to do as Pope for the church, but for the world, was finally reckon with what had been laid bare by the priestly sex abuse scandal. And he's failed to do it. That's my perception. He has failed to do it. And when I realized that even Francis was in the grip of this clericalism, this culture of priestly exception that is at the root of the dysfunction of sex abuse in the church, when I saw that even Francis couldn't reckon with it, something, as I say in this book, snapped in me. The corruption was not news, but the depth of the corruption that prevented even the best of the Catholic Church, and that's what Francis in a way represents to me, that prevents even the best to deal with the corruption, meant to me that business as usual as a Catholic was over. I haven't, quote, left the church, but I've stepped back from my practice of the faith. I don't go to Mass now. I'm in exile from normal practice of the faith. And that's my own way of refusing to go on with business as usual. And I lay out an explanation and a challenge in this book to invite other people, whether they're Catholics, former Catholics, people who had nothing to do with the church, to take an attitude and a position about this problem, because it goes even more deeply into the life of the world than this particular religion. That's a bit of a long-winded way of answering your question about how this corruption has landed on me, but that's it.
Sure. You know, you mentioned a moment when you snapped, and I think that's a very compelling part of the book. And there's a particular anecdote. There's something that Francis said that really was the kind of straw that broke the camel's back for you. Do you want to recount for us what that was?
Well, the season of the snap was the summer of 2018, when Pope Francis went to Ireland on a so-called papal visit or pilgrimage. And a lot of us thought, well, this will be the occasion finally for Francis to unveil a serious dismantling of the structure of clericalism, which has led to this criminal behavior on the part of the church. Why? Because Ireland was ground zero of the priest abuse crisis. When you and your colleagues at the Globe laid bare the sordid underside of life in Boston, a lot of people in Rome, elsewhere, said, well, that's just Boston.
Right.
Because of the neurotic Catholic Boston relationship to the Brahmin establishment. The Boston Catholics have a special problem.
Right.
Well, boom, what you guys set in motion led quickly to the revelations that it wasn't a Boston problem, it was an American problem. The Europeans immediately said, well, that's an American problem.
Right.
It's American Catholics have that problem.
Right.
No, boom, Germany, France, Austria, Poland, the Netherlands. We have yet to really see the reckoning in Italy and some other places. But the next thing you know, over these years, we're looking at a problem that exists everywhere there are Catholic priests, nowhere more grievously than in Ireland. And in Ireland, something approaching 20,000 victims of priests in a small country. I've said before, I say in the book, it's reasonable to think that everyone in Ireland is somehow related to a victim of a priest, which of course accounts for the collapse of the Catholic Church in Ireland.
Right.
And that's what Pope Francis was walking into. And that's why some of us thought, here is when he'll begin to reckon with it. And he didn't. That was also the season of revelations in Philadelphia. A grand jury laid bare accusations against hundreds of priests involving more than 1,000 children. It was also when 15 US attorneys general opened up investigations against Catholic dioceses around the United States. Soon thereafter, Cardinal McCarrick was found guilty of abuse by a Vatican tribunal, one of the most powerful figures in the Catholic Church. Mike, you remember it. I'm not telling you anything, but all of this came crashing down, a tsunami of revelation around the time of Pope Francis's pilgrimage. And when he was there, the thing that you're referring to, what I recount in this book, the snap, one of the most scandalous aspects of the Irish story was the so-called Magdalene laundries.
Right.
A revelation that broke the heart of the Irish people because it showed not just priests, but nuns were capable of great cruelty. The so-called Ryan Report, which came out after the Spotlight team did its work in Boston, but had been underway for some years before that. And the Ryan Report showed that hundreds of Catholic church-run institutions were treating children as slaves, and in many cases, sex slaves. Pope Francis was asked about the Magdalene laundries, these homes for unwed mothers run by sisters, where women and children were subject to grotesque forms of abuse, and where it was exposed then hundreds, many hundreds of corpses of babies were uncovered in the grounds of some of these convents, some of them thrown into sewage pits. It was a scandal that kind of arrived as a crescendo in Ireland. There were movies made about it. There were documentary films. There was a film starring Judi Dench called Philomena.
I saw it, yeah.
It was a huge scandal. Pope Francis was asked about it by a reporter on his airplane going back to Rome. And his answer was what made me snap. He said, "I do not know about these. They call them," his phrase was, the laundromat ladies.
Yes.
Or something like, I use the word laundromat.
Yes.
I do not know about these things. I do not know about them. He denied knowing about them. And I thought at the time, the Pope must be lying because it was so well known. How could he not? And I later thought, well, that's unfair of me, which it is. But even if he was telling the truth and didn't know them, that said something almost as bad. How could the Pope of the Catholic Church not know about this depth of scandal? And that's when I thought, snap, Jim, Pope Francis too is in the grip of this malicious, dysfunctional, criminal culture. And when a figure of his generosity and goodness, which is so clear and palpable, when a figure of his depth of goodness is at the mercy of this, I thought, this clericalism, this priests apart, priests above, priests unaccountable, priests protected, this clericalism is demonic, and I can no longer associate myself with it. And I haven't been to Mass as a Catholic since then.
Well, for you, that's saying a great deal. I mean, that was a lifelong practice for you. And so that is a reflection of the impact this has had on you. You go at some length persuasively in the book to talk about how it is that Pope Francis seems to have this incredible blind spot when it comes to clergy sex abuse. And you do finger clericalism as the dark villain in the story. I wondered if you could just define clericalism a little bit more for people and talk about how it came to be that clericalism gave rise to this crisis.
Well, we think of the priest in the Catholic Church as having going all the way back to Jesus. In fact, the Catholic Church says that the 12 apostles were the first priests. And because they were all men, women can't be priests. So there's this notion that the priesthood was there at the beginning. It's not true. The priesthood as we know it evolved over the centuries, beginning in the Roman Empire when the Catholic Church and the Roman Empire became the same thing, when the officials of the church took on the characteristics of Roman officials. So priests became officials of the church. And then in the Middle Ages, when the pyramid structure of Catholic power was created, imitating the monarchies of the Middle Ages, with the Pope at the top, like a king, the bishops, like royalty, arrayed along the side of the pyramid, and then at the bottom, the priests, all of them officials in this power structure. Clericalism is the power structure. The reason the bishops looked the other way when predator priests were exposed wasn't because they were indifferent to the crimes of these priests. No, it wasn't. It wasn't that they didn't care about the children. It was that the most important thing for them was protecting this pyramid of power on which their own status depended. And the way to do that was to protect everybody in it. So even a predator priest joined on that pyramid of power had to be protected. So he was not held accountable. He was moved to some place where he wasn't known. He was able to go on abusing people and so on. That's the first thing I would say about clericalism. Of course, it depends on three pillars. Number one, it's all male. This is a male supremacist structure.
Right.
The denigration of women is essential to it.
Right.
Which is why no women can be priests. The nonsense about the 12 apostles, no women in the 12 apostles, therefore no women can be priests. That's crazy.
In the book, you describe that as a quote, blatant lie, unquote.
It is a blatant lie. The only priests the apostles knew were the Jewish priests at the temple. That's the only way that priesthood had meaning in the time of Jesus. No women can be priests. Priests have to be celibate. Sexual control of priests is essential to this. The same way the sexual control by the hierarchy of lay people through an erotic sexual morality, including the condemnation of birth control and so forth. Women absolutely not allowed to be sexually autonomous persons. So all male priesthood, celibate priesthood, but there's a third leg to the structure of clericalism, which is a damning God, a God who is so offended by the sin of Adam and Eve, especially Eve, put it on the woman, so offended by the sin of Adam and Eve, the fall, that God requires human beings to suffer to make up for that sin. The economy of suffering as willed by God. God damns you if you don't make up for the sin that you committed and that you've inherited from Adam and Eve. This structure of doom is a structure from which we lay people are protected by what? The ministries of the priest. We go to confession. Confession saves us from the God of doom. When I grew up as a kid, we had a card we used to carry in our wallet, we Catholics. It said, in case of an accident, please call a priest. What was that about? I needed to have a priest forgive my sins on my moment of death. Otherwise, I was going to go to hell. I mean, excuse me, what kind of God is this? What kind of sadist monster is this? I'm supposed to want to spend all eternity in heaven with such a figure? One of the sad things about Pope Francis is he's thoroughly repudiated the leftover legacy of the God of doom, which the Catholic Church began to come out from under during the Second Vatican Council. Pope Francis published a wonderful book about the mercy of God. Mercy is Pope Francis's calling card. God is merciful, not damning. But even last week or 10 days ago, the Vatican issued a rejection of gay marriage, saying that God does not bless sin. God does not bless these relationships. That's the old damning, dooming God from whom Pope Francis had declared independence in the beginning of his papacy, when he said about gay people, who am I to judge?
Right.
It's a long way from who am I to judge to what we got last week about God doesn't bless sin. So clericalism is this entire structure of power anti-sex, anti-woman, anti-lay people. And its intention is to protect the power of the hierarchy. It's a violation of human rights. It's a violation of justice, but more to the point for us Catholics, it's a violation of the gospel. It betrays everything that Jesus Christ stood for. Clericalism is the problem, Mike. I'm not telling you anything, but the Catholic Church has yet to deal with it.
I wondered if you could stay on just one of those three for a second, which is celibacy, because I think a lot of people outside the Catholic Church and many people within the Catholic Church don't understand why it's a requirement. And as you point out in your book, it was not a requirement until the First Lateran Council of 1123. So if the Church went so long without the celibacy requirement, how is it that Pope Francis and his predecessors have refused to even discuss the matter?
Well, that's another great question. The first 1,000 years of the Catholic Church, most priests and even many bishops were married people with wives and children. It was when the Catholic Church embraced the culture of the monarchy of the Middle Ages. Really, you remember that, I mean, we have fantasies about the Crusades and King Richard the Lionheart and the great figures of royalty that begin to come into European culture at that point. The papacy reimagined itself around the structure of royalty. And it was beginning then that this power system was embraced by the church. And one of the ways that the church had to embrace that power system was by controlling its property, which meant that the people administering the property, priests, shouldn't have heirs, so that the church itself wouldn't have to compete with the heirs of clergy for ownership of property, vast swaths of land, especially in Europe, but also that the inner lives of priests, subject to this power structure, needed to be controlled. And the control of sexuality, the control of sexual identity, is a profound way of controlling a person. Celibacy is a function of church power over clergy. It's also rooted in a deeply neurotic rejection of human sexuality that goes back to mistaken readings of the story of Adam and Eve, which understood the fall as a sexual sin. There's no reason in the scripture to see it that way. We don't want to go too far in the weeds here, but this is an idea that begins with power with St. Augustine, and it comes into its own with the celibate priest and the sexually neurotic Catholic. Sex as an occasion of sin, right. Sexual license, sexual autonomy, therefore no birth control, abortion, an absolute moral prohibition, no room for complexity, no identity as a gay person, although clearly in the Catholic tradition, many clergy have been gay.
Sure.
So there's and the deep contradiction in that gay clergy themselves forced to demonize gay sex is a signal of the deep neurosis of this system. So I'm talking about clericalism, Mike.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's a simple idea, and once you open your mind to it, you realize how dark and really destructive it is. And Catholic priests today are at the mercy of it. And many of them, most of them, live heroic lives despite the strictures of the clerical culture. But alas, many of them, most of them, have been forced by that culture into a kind of complicity with those who are prone to abuse others out of that culture. So how is it that so many, not just bishops, but priests were silent or looked the other way when their brother priests were raping children?
To me, that complicity is a huge part of the phenomenon of clergy abuse in the Catholic Church. And it's Exhibit A and why it's so difficult to root out. That complicity, I think, that you point out is key. I have my critics in my reporting, and I'm sure you have yours in your writing. And my critics often say to me, "Why are you so taken with sex abuse in the Catholic Church? We have sex abuse in the Boy Scouts. We have sex abuse in the public schools. We have sex abuse even on the U.S. Gymnastics team." And you point all of that out in your book, and yet you say, but clergy sex abuse, child sex abuse in the Catholic Church stands apart. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that. Why is it so much more important to focus on sexual abuse in the Catholic Church than sex abuse in other institutions?
The stories that you and your colleagues at the Boston Globe laid bare again and again and again showed how priests in abusing children invoked the name of God.
Yes.
They invoked the name of God. This is what God wants us to do. You are special to God because of this. They even exploited the sacrament of penance, confession, approaching people in confession. Cardinal Law famously, and you reported this, silenced an accuser by ordering him under the seal of confession to tell no one of his accusation. You remember that incident?
I do remember I'll never forget it.
Yeah. The priest sex abuser, unlike the Boy Scout sex abuser, say, or even the family sex abuser, tragically, the family is a locus of sex abuse too. But unlike all of those others, there's a kind of transcendent element to what the priest is doing, which makes the victim all the more vulnerable, especially when the culture of silence in the name of God is imposed on the victim. The trauma you're reporting shows this. The trauma that victims of priests carry away from this experience is itself transcendent. It's of a special order, not to mention the way in which this violation of the claims made for what the priesthood is, exceptionally virtuous, exceptionally generous, selfless. Celibacy is a symbol of the priest giving himself wholly to the community, not putting himself first. Poverty, chastity, and obedience, the claims made for the priest. This crime in this context is of a different order. I'm not telling you anything, you've seen it, but that's the answer. You see it in the rage and the wound of the victims. The victims always must be front and center for us as the standard against which we measure the meaning of this crime. And when you listen to the testimony of victims and you've made it powerful, then you do understand that something uniquely malevolent is at work here. And that goes to the bishops then, who treat this as not that big a deal, and who continue to think rhetorical expressions of sorrow are enough, instead of seriously dismantling what led to it and what keeps it going.
Yes, I think the situation with the bishops is particularly noteworthy. Very, very few have been disciplined for covering up clergy sex abuse. There's been a recent provision to deal with bishops who cover up clergy sex abuse. You mentioned it in your book. It's the Pope's encyclical, You are the light of the world. And that seemed to me to be really kind of a toothless attempt to discipline bishops or hold bishops account who cover up clergy sex abuse. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because that was really heavily promoted by the Vatican as Pope Francis's way of dealing with this crisis once and for all.
I began by referring to the summer of 2018, the pressure built on Pope Francis to address this crisis, which he hadn't really done. He announced, in response to the pushback he was getting after Ireland, that he would begin to address it by summoning a meeting of bishops in Rome. I believe he announced that in September or October for the following February.
Right.
Some of us were immediately suspicious. I've said, I said, it's like asking the mafia chieftains to be on the crime commission.
Yes, you did.
And sure enough, the bishops met in Rome. Remember that the bishops are complicit in this problem. The very people who've been covering it up for years, 2 decades now, just since the Globe. 2 decades just since the Globe, since you guys.
That's right.
But going back decades before that, at the first revelations, these bishops are complicit. And they had their meeting. They reported to the Pope. That was in February. And then a couple of months later, I think it was in May, the document you're referring to, You Are the Light of the World, was published. And what was the main solution to the problem? When priests or bishops are accused of a crime against a child, the meeting was called On the Protection of Children.
Right.
When they're accused, they're obliged to report it. Report it to whom?
There we go.
Report it to other bishops.
Right.
There's no requirement in You Are the Light of the World to report these crimes to civil authority, even though in many countries they're obliged to. So if priests or bishops obey the law in the United States, they will report the crime to civil authorities as they're obliged to, but there's no requirement from the church that they do that. There's no requirement of transparency in You Are the Light of the World. There's no requirement that the accusations be made in any way transparent or the adjudication of them be transparent. There's no requirement for participation of lay people in this adjudication of accusations. And there's no mandated penalty. Listen, if a woman attempts to say mass, she's, by virtue of that attempt, excommunicated from the church.
Right.
There's no equivalent penalty for an abusing priest, even today. There's
Right.
no mandated removal from holy orders. So what you have in that document from the spring of 2019, You Are the Light of the World, which is touted, as you say, as the church is finally reckoning with this problem. It's a clericalist protection of clericalism.
It keeps it all in-house.
The structure of bishops protecting bishops, priests protecting priests is still in place.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I thought that was particularly dispiriting when that finally came out. I mean, by then, as you said, many of us were suspicious from the beginning, but still, it seemed to present no real substantive progress on the issue.
And it's, by the way, it seems like the last word. Have you noticed? I mean, the subject has disappeared from discourse in the church, as far as I'm aware.
Exactly. No, that was supposed to be the last word, and maybe it will be the last word, at least until the next crisis explodes, which is inevitable.
Right.
Who knows where it will be, but it's inevitable because the church has not found a way to deal with it. It's going to be I think it'll be one crisis after another, and they'll start developing in other parts of the world. Already in Latin America, many victims are coming forward, and I personally was impressed with the huge blind spot Pope Francis has on this issue when he referred to the victims of Caradima in Chile as liars. And it was, I thought, a moment of candor as opposed to a moment of pique. I thought he was really expressing his true feeling. And there have just been incident after incident, like the one with the Magdalene laundry in Ireland, where he just seems to, he's either afraid of the issue, he doesn't understand the issue. I'm not sure what it is, but I have to agree with your assessment that he has failed to deal with it in a substantive and effective way.
I think on the Chile liars moment, he did repent of that.
He did repent of that. He did in a major way.
Yeah. But nevertheless,
still, I thought it was a measure of his feeling, his emotion.
in his goodness, he's a man of his own lifelong experience. He's been living inside this clerical culture. And even though he has some capacity to criticize it, he does actually criticize clericalism. But it's never, but it's never clear what he means by it.
Yeah, he often criticizes it as he upholds it.
Yes, he does. And so there's a kind of tragic quality of being caught in his own life experience, caught by the limits of his situation. He's presiding over a profoundly confused and dysfunctional structure at the Vatican with a lot of reactionary Catholics who are pushing back against him.
Right.
They clearly are having an effect, which is why there's such a difference between the statement 2 weeks ago on gay people and gay marriage from earlier in his pontificate.
Sure.
But it's the final message of it, of course, is the power of this pyramidal structure. It's not going to go easily, but I also don't believe that it's going to be able to stand up, the only institution in the world that will stand up against the rising wave of feminist rejection of such male abuse. And women in the Catholic Church are going to be are already the point persons of real demand for change, and that's happening.
Yes, that brings me to something I wanted to talk about before we get too late in the evening, which is the ending of your book, where you do have a prescription for how the church might change and how people might change the church, and a hopeful message when it comes to the faith of individuals, particularly in Jesus Christ, who is the truth at the heart of the lie that you mentioned. So I did want to give you a chance to speak about how things might turn in a positive direction.
Well, people tuning in tonight might be surprised, given the strong critique we're both leveling against the power structure of the church, to know that in the end, I have chosen not to leave the Catholic Church. I'm an internal exile, is how I think of myself, on the margin of the church, but speaking back to the center of it and calling for change. And the reason is simple. I believe that the church exists to keep the memory of Jesus Christ alive, to make his presence felt. Jesus Christ is real to me. I owe my connection to Jesus Christ to the church. And I'm desperate to protect that connection. I also am deeply, deeply connected to the vast population of Catholics, more than 1 billion people all over the planet. And they are people who are doing the work of the church, of the Lord, what we used to call the corporal works of mercy, the spiritual works of mercy, doctors and nurses and medical people, clinics, schools, tens of thousands of education centers, women leading these efforts in many, if not most places, all people associated with the Catholic Church. And it's an institution that's not going to go away. Yeah. I associate with those people. They are the church. And I also associate with the impulse that I've seen in my own life story, which began with the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, when the church began to reckon with its grievous failure during the Holocaust. And what did the council do as a first order of business? It overturned the roots of anti-Semitism in Catholic and Christian life, repudiated the Christ killer charge against the Jews, and it also repudiated the idea that God has turned away from the Jewish people. Those are the single most important theological changes in the history of Christianity. And they're much larger than anything having to do with sex or gender. So change is possible. I've seen it in my own life and in my own life in the church. I'm desperate for that kind of change still.
I think that's a great note to just turn to questions right now. Change is possible. I think that's very important to keep in mind. I've seen it over and over and over again. So this is a question that I think you might be especially interested in. It's the individual says, I'm a pastor at a city parish here in Boston and have been serving as a priest for 24 years. At this critical moment in church history, what advice and counsel would you give to those of us who are working against the tide of clericalism and the many wrongs that you point out in your latest book?
I welcome that observation and question, and I'll answer it quite forthrightly. First of all, though, I'd like to say I salute you for your struggle, Father, and I'm grateful to you for it. And I think I understand what's implied in your comment and question. And I think of all the many, many, many priests I've known and know who are in a similar situation, heroic people, in my view. But I will also say that priests have huge power at this moment in the life of the church. And priests as a group are not exercising it. Priests know of the corruptions of clericalism as well or better than anybody. And if priests as a group, whether in a diocese, a nation, a region, or perhaps even globally, could somehow raise their voice demanding change, admit women to the priesthood, change the rule on celibacy, move away from these negative, neurotic emphases on sexual morality. If priests did that, the power of their voice would break the logjam. And I think back to the greatest example of this I know of took place here in Boston. Perhaps, Father, you knew some of these folks or know them, some are still here, but you know, Cardinal Law was riding high when the Boston Globe Spotlight team did its work. And Cardinal Law had the full backing, even as the scandal was laid bare, of the powers in Rome. It was only when the priests of the Archdiocese of Boston addressed a public letter to Cardinal Law. Your Eminence, we, the undersigned priests of the Archdiocese, I'm paraphrasing, have lost confidence in you, and we are calling on you to resign. And it was a letter signed by, I believe, 51 senior priests, mostly pastors, a lot of them, and some of them friends of mine. And Cardinal Law resigned immediately. The support he still had in Rome, which would have kept him in office, was indicated by the fact that he went to Rome immediately and was given a prestigious sinecure in Rome, which he had until he died.
Right.
If it weren't for the priests of the Archdiocese of Boston, the scandal in Boston would have festered on in even more destructive ways. And who knows what would have happened. The great prophetic witness of those priests made a difference. I think that there are versions of that could happen today. I think that priests in Boston could make a vociferous challenge to the inhuman, male supremacist, unjust exclusion of women from the priesthood. And they could make a clear and authentic challenge to the anti-female, sexist, corrupt tradition of required priestly celibacy, just for starters.
Yes, you know, it seems to me that at the end of your book, you really are calling for a spirit of activism within the church.
Resistance is the word we used to use in the anti-war movement back in the day at BU. Just
Sure.
You and I, Mike, were talking earlier about having BU in common. Resistance is what's needed. Anti-clericalism from within is what I call it. Anti-clericalism from within. And we are the conscientious objectors of the church. We need to raise our voices. We don't need to just sit quietly and detach ourselves from this. We need to resist it, fight it. It's why I've written this book. We all have ways to do this, those of us. And many Catholics are doing it just by walking away, which is also a powerful statement. You know, the second largest religious denomination in America, religious denomination defined broadly, is former Catholics.
Hmm.
And that in itself is a powerful witness. So I think that we all, the church belongs to the people, and the people have to take charge of it.
Here's a question that goes to your point. The person asks, do you remember the group Voice of the Faithful? Would such a group help correct these problems? Perhaps we can reintroduce the group. Your thoughts?
Voice of the Faithful was one of the immediate and powerful responses to the Globe Spotlight work. I was privileged to address one of the first Voice of the Faithful meetings. It was held at the Heinz Auditorium, several thousand people demanding church. That the slogan of Voice of the Faithful was, keep the faith, change the church.
Right.
And
right.
that's the perfect slogan for this movement. Voice of the Faithful still goes on. It hasn't been as powerful as it was in the beginning, because for many reasons, largely, I think a lot of people have walked away, but also because business as usual has become kind of a note of the life of the church. Voice of the Faithful and versions of it are crucial going forward. And there are many quieter movements of resistance within the Catholic tradition right now. There are groups led by women leading religious services, including in the Eucharistic tradition, lay people having meetings. There's a wonderful, powerful international movement of Catholic lay people demanding change. So these things are happening, and it's actually not hard to find instances of it all around us.
You know, you've touched on this issue, but I just want to say there are several questions here asking you to address the subject of women's ordination. And this one says, especially as a remedy to address the current moral crisis within the church. And if so, if you do support this, then how do you express your support, and how should one express support for women's ordination? I think you've addressed that, but I did want to point out that we have many questions about this subject.
But women's ordination is the point of the wedge. It's not like, and when we say women's ordination, we're not talking about bringing women into a sinecure on that pyramid. We're talking about overthrowing the pyramid. The opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy, it's democracy. We're talking about democracy, power to the people. And that begins in the Catholic instance with power to women. The movement to bring women full into the priesthood is itself a decisive element of change that would begin to change the entire culture. Similarly, bringing married people into the priesthood would begin to change the entire culture. And it's not as far-fetched as it seems. Let me just quickly say, not so long ago, the Pope summoned all of the bishops from the Amazon basin in Latin America to come to Rome to address the major crisis of the priest shortage in the Amazon region. 10,000 Catholics for every priest, as opposed to in the United States, it's 2,000 or 3,000 Catholics for every priest. The priest shortage, a major crisis for the Catholic Church in the Amazon. The Amazon bishops asked the Pope to two things. One, allow married deacons to become priests, which would have brought married men into the priesthood. And two, to bring women into the diaconate. Now the diaconate, this seems a little bit obscure perhaps, but the diaconate is one of the holy orders that for most of 1500 years was part of the clerical system. It went into disuse hundreds of years ago, but it was brought back in the 1960s, the diaconate, married people who are not in the clerical culture, but who are doing everything priests do except say mass, hear confessions, and I think administer the last rites. But they preach, they preside at weddings, they preside at baptisms. They're part of the clerical system, if you will, without being part of the clerical culture. That's an example of how Francis could move this thing forward. Ordaining women, Catholic people need to demand it. It's a matter of justice. this is the era of Me Too. Is the Catholic Church really going to be immune from the demands of women to be treated as full equals?
Here's another question that I think is kind of right up your alley in several different ways. The questioner says, can we rely on priests to be change agents? They have been taught, brainwashed to follow. I think it is similar to a soldier and the hierarchy of the military.
Well, alas, implied in that question is the disappointment many of us feel that priests as a group, even while individually they may be heroically standing for a new kind of church, as group they are not, and one does wonder why. I remember from my own time as a priest the pressures, also the feelings of, frankly, the feelings of unworthiness that went hand in hand with the call to be perfect, which was one of the things that we felt obliged to imagine, which is itself a kind of inhuman fantasy. I wouldn't be so harsh as to say priests are brainwashed, but priests are fully inculcated into the culture and system of clericalism. Even those priests who are wise enough and humane enough to reject it in principle, but they have to find ways to reject it in reality. Some of my most vociferous critics are liberal priests who insist that I'm wrong when I indict the priesthood as such by saying that they want to distinguish between the wicked clericalism and the good priesthood. But my own view, what I've come to in these 2 years, is that the priesthood as such is poisoned by the culture of clericalism.
This is a question that goes, I think, directly to the end of your book, and it goes like this. Given the lack of traction that's been made on all these issues and the continuing power structure, what is the incentive to stay instead of practicing somewhere more progressive or leaving organized religion altogether?
Well, that's a decision to be made in the sacred confines of one's own conscience. And I know many, many good people who've left the Catholic Church, and I understand it, and I even salute it. I'm making a different choice, and I'm not actually, I'm inviting others to consider it, but I'm not actually advocating it. My own view is this institution is worth fighting for. I believe that the future of the human species, I don't want to be grand about it, but this is what I believe. The future of the human species at a time when we're threatened with self-extinction in any number of ways, our technologies, our weapons, our corruption of the climate. When we're threatened with self-extinction, I think the human species is desperately in need of a humane, reformed, justice-minded Roman Catholic Church, if only because of the scale of it. More than 1 billion people crossing every boundary, rich, poor, illiterate, intellectually sophisticated. These are human beings everywhere on the planet, and their common wealth, their community could be a tremendous force for good as the human species confronts the very dangerous future. Where else do I have such access to influence on the great questions of war and climate and peace? Well, as a citizen of the United States, yes. And that's why I am, a devoted, committed person working for justice and peace in the United States, but also as a Catholic, because this institution carries that kind of historical weight.
This is an issue that we have not touched on, but I'd be curious about your thoughts. The question is, in the present time, how does the wealth of the church relate to clericalism?
Well, clericalism also suggests a lack of transparency, that power structure I'm talking about. It protects itself. It's committed to its own preservation above all. the wealth of it is part of the story. The Catholic Church began a democratic reform with the Second Vatican Council. It was short-circuited by panic-stricken bishops and a couple of panic-stricken popes. But one of the most important elements of that reform that wasn't implemented was transparency across the board of all kinds. And financial transparency is key. And the scandal of the church's abuse of money and wealth is one of the things that needs to be confronted. And you, Mike, brought this to the fore with your reporting about the way in which the Catholic bishops of the United States were exploiting the COVID relief money.
Exactly.
Would you just, in a nutshell, remind me what you found?
Sure. We found that the Catholic Church requested and received more than $3 billion in coronavirus relief aid through the Paycheck Protection Program. And we also showed that at the same time, many dioceses were sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars in surplus funds, and altogether, the church was sitting on billions while taking billions of taxpayer money that theoretically should have been going to struggling small businesses. So it strikes me that the Catholic Church is very concerned about money. It is part of the power structure, without any question.
And therefore, the questioner raised a crucially important point.
I think that's right. I think it's right. It definitely figures. I mean, you know, the Boston Archdiocese has closed many schools for a variety of different reasons, but the Boston Archdiocese has about $200 million in reserve funds. That's not including any of its property. This is money on reserve. And there is a Boston Schools Foundation that has $33 million on reserve, uncommitted funds. So there's no doubt that the Catholic Church likes acquiring money. We see it all the time, and it is part of the power structure, and it perpetuates the power structure.
So a democratic reform of the church, which is what I'm talking about, would address that problem, bringing in lay people, transparency, accountability, basic principles of democratic liberalism, which are nowhere in practice in the church today.
You know, some of these questions just reflect some frustration. Somebody asks here, how do you reckon with something so large, so global? Can change ever happen?
I want to just return to something I referred to in passing before.
Sure.
The most important change in the Catholic Church in my lifetime, and I would argue in the entire history of the Catholic Church, took place in 1964 and 1965 in relationship to the church's teaching on Jews and Judaism. Look, it's in the Gospels. The Gospels scapegoat a group called the Jews for the murder of Jesus. It was the Romans who murdered Jesus. If you read the Gospel account as history, you would think Pontius Pilate was a good guy who was forced to kill Jesus by the Jews. That's how deep into the Catholic Christian imagination anti-Judaism goes. Anti-Judaism was exposed for what it was and what it did in the anti-Semitism of lethal, genocidal Nazi murder. After that, the Catholic Church saw it. That's what led to the Second Vatican Council, which is why its first order of business was to change what it was believing and teaching about the Jews. Right. Renounce the Christ killer charge, contradicting the gospel's own account, and renounce the idea that God replaced the chosen people of the Jews with the chosen people of the church. Gone. Theologically deleted. Now, it's true that the church is still at the mercy of the hangover of this tradition. And in Holy Week, next week, Christians, Catholics all over the world will hear the Jews scapegoated again in the Gospels. And hopefully priests and preachers will preach those texts against themselves and show how it's not true. That won't happen much. But my point is, great change can happen, and it can happen quickly. It takes an historical moment, the Holocaust, and it takes great leadership, Pope John the 23rd, and excuse me, and the fathers of the Second Vatican Council, who themselves lived through the Holocaust. We have an equivalent moment now. If the massive rape of children and the cover-up preferring predators to victims isn't a crime of the scale needed to change at these basic levels, this corruption of clericalism, what is? And I do believe, and I'd like to, before we end, just acknowledge that if it weren't for the work of journalists and then lawyers, and then the victims themselves, the scandal of that massive crime against children by Catholic priests would still be, if not completely hidden, it would still be on the margin of people's consciousness. So I don't want to have this conversation end without saluting you again, Mike, and the really crucial work you did for all those victims, for the truth, for the broad culture, but also for the Catholic Church. You, I hope you won't be insulted if I call it a kind of ministry that you did and that you're doing still.
No, in fact, I'm flattered. And, you know, the purpose of my journalism is to make change. And so I'm grateful that I've had an opportunity to make change. And I think the best thing about tonight is your very powerful and profound message that change with activism is possible.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much, not just for your time, but for the incredible amount of work you've done and, you know, exposing these problems and, you know, being a voice and using your platforms to, you know, help those who need someone to speak for them. And I'm really, really happy that you're here today and speaking to us. So thank you very much on behalf of Harvard Bookstore. Thank you so, so much. To everyone who is watching tonight, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting of indie book selling and the Harvard Bookstore publishers, authors, and the incredible staff who is working every day to bring events like this to you. I'm really, really, really sorry if we didn't get to your questions. Unfortunately, there's just so many wonderful questions tonight, but luckily there's a beautiful book. It's called The Truth at the Heart of the Lie, and there is a link in the chat if you would like to purchase. From all of us at Harvard Bookstore, continue to shop indie, continue to shop local, and thank you so much. James, Mike, any final words?
I'd love to say thank you to you, Audrey, and to Jeff. Please give Jeff my regards.
I will, absolutely.
But my last word has to be another word of thanks to you, Mike. What a privilege to be with you this evening. And your thoughtful reading of my book is a great gift. I don't take it for granted.
That's a wonderful book. Really a wonderful book. Thanks, Audrey. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.